So I'm going to begin in a confessional mode. I'm not one of you. I'm not a health person. I'm a reporter. I'm a journalist. So basically, this is kind of story time for you, I guess. I'm just going to read a piece. It's kind of a zeitgeist piece about a generation of people growing up in the shadow of HIV and AIDS. It wasn't a story that I wanted to write, which is probably why it was an important story to tell. And what you're going to hear today is a heavily abridged version of what actually appeared in The Walrus, which is being helpfully laid out for you there, so you can take those if you want. Sam grew up in an Alberta hamlet. It's a kind of place of no consequence except to anyone that was fortunate enough to be born there. The kind of place where you raise 2 fingers off the steering wheel in greeting when you pass people on the road. Sam was a good kid, though a hurting one. He had journals filled with dark confessions. He had legs covered with scars from the time a pot of boiling water poured all over his body when he was 3. He was also gay and needed to get to a city. By his 28th birthday, having rolled through a few towns already, he found himself in Vancouver, searching for love. One night in October 2001, he let a man inside him for 10 seconds before muttering, "Hey, you should probably put on a condom." Symptoms showed up almost immediately. Sam's hands and feet became swollen. His tongue got itchy. His glands ballooned. There was dandruff in his golden brown eyebrows. He flipped through a book called The New Joy of Gay Sex and learned that after HIV enters your body, there are 7 typical symptoms. He had all 7. For the next 8 months, he sat with his self-diagnosis, unwilling to get tested. When he finally went to the clinic on Davie Street, a nurse gave him his results and said, "Do you need a hug?" "Yes," said Sam. Then he walked out into the afternoon, found a park and lay down in the grass. He stayed there for a few minutes and just thought, He cried only once the following day when he thought about telling his parents, but he knew by the time he'd wiped his eyes dry that he couldn't. At a certain point, he said to himself, you have to become a caretaker to your mom and dad, and this would hurt them too much. So several names in the story have been changed because of mothers that don't know that their children are positive. Sam didn't think of his diagnosis as a death sentence the way he would have just a decade earlier. Thanks to the miraculous drug cocktails that appeared in '96, HIV-positive people are now only living slightly shortened lives. The disease is more a chronic condition than a plague. For years, though, he felt like a sexual leper, as if poison ran through his veins, which in a sense it did. Like many others, Sam chose not to start a drug regimen until it became necessary. His doctors monitored his weakening immune system. Sam adjusted to becoming one of the estimated 65,000 people in Canada living with HIV. And then something in his body swung wildly off course. Though his T-cell count was still high enough that his doctors weren't worried, Sam's body wasn't in agreement. He lost weight and couldn't stay on his feet for the 8 hours necessary to hold down his job in retail. Finally, baffled, the doctors admitted him to Ward 10C in St. Paul's, it's the HIV ward, where he would languish in bed for the next month. But the meds the doctors prescribed didn't cure. While he lay there, Sam kept a score sheet, a page in his journal full of ticks like the ones that prisoners keep on their walls. He was counting the number of doctors that inspected him, 21, and the number of times they took his blood, 72. While the search stalled, Sam learned that back in Alberta, his cancer-ridden father was in hospital too. My dad's on his deathbed, he told his friends when they came by with armloads of comic books. Mom wants me to come home. You have to tell them why you can't come, they said. Before he could decide whether to inform his parents about his status, the doctors gave him more bad news. His weakened immune system had left him vulnerable to an extremely rare and often incurable disorder called Castleman's disease. He was developing lymphoma and throat cancer. A doctor gave him the same prognosis that thousands of gay men in the HIV ward have received. You've got 6 months to a year. Sam called his mother and told her he couldn't make it home, but he refused to tell her why. He didn't want his dad to die knowing that his son was dying too. So in a final, desperate act of familial protection, he kept the unhappy truth to himself and left his parents wondering. He didn't cry into his pillow or rage against God. He wrote a makeshift will and with a friend planned his own funeral. When I first heard Sam's story, I was shocked. It seemed like a tale out of step, out of time. I knew, or I had a sense anyway, that tens of thousands of Canadians were living with HIV. But with all the talk of undetectable viral loads and advertisements on bus shelters for one-pill-a-day lifestyles, it hadn't occurred to me that people still suffered and even died from this virus. In South Africa, sure. But like so many of the millennial generation, I prefer to think of my urbane North American self as post-AIDS. Meanwhile, a new study out of Vancouver tells us that gay men who live here, nearly 1 in 5 of us have contracted the virus. The same study found that almost a quarter of men under the age 30 have never even been tested. For my friends and me, post-AIDS refers to more than a disease. It's post-protest, post-outrage, post-victimization. It touches our entire lives and leaves us with a deep-seated and cruel distaste for the sissy boys who dominated our representation in films and TV. After all, wasn't it the bottoms that got AIDS? It means vainly attempting to make up new ways of talking, walking, and loving, because the old ways are stained with disaster. We're the first generation of gay men to grow up free of overwhelming oppression and imminent crisis. Growing up after AIDS means profiting from the civil rights battles that it occasioned. But in some ways, we're still hopelessly lost. A generation of men who could have been our mentors was decimated. The only thing we learned from observing them was to ruthlessly identify AIDS face, that skeletal appearance. But those faces grow more rare each day. And without the agonizing deaths to serve as warnings, without the ravaged bodies that once testified to the reality of HIV, many of my peers have found themselves slipping up during sex without being terribly worried. Gay men, like anyone, are well aware that we ought to use condoms. Just as the more than 5 million smokers in the country realize that the benefits of nicotine are limited to momentary gratification. Just as the more than 2 million Canadian diabetics know that chocolate cake is a transitory pleasure with real consequences. None of us live rational lives. We rely on concerted efforts by health agencies, that's you guys, to counter the haplessness of our lived experience. And this is doubly so when it comes to HIV. Having never known a world without the virus makes it hard to even notice the thing. How long, really, can a small segment of the population be suspended in catastrophe? This is a little skip now forward in the story. Charles has always been good-looking. He's not so beautiful as to be ruined by it, but he's blessed with an affable grin and an easy manner that allow him to charm without trying. We met a decade ago when we were both 20 at a now demolished bar called the Odyssey. Outside at 2 a.m, he hoisted the front of his T-shirt to show me his new nipple ring, which I silently disapproved of, but which he didn't keep me from taking down his number on one of these little cards they had that said, "Call me." He told me he was technically married, and as gay marriage would not become legal for several years yet, that meant to a woman, which naturally made him even more attractive. To him, the act of being with a man so unthinkable during his rural upbringing held all the promise of a new life. For me, it felt good to be an actor in that romance. The first time we went to bed together, he kept saying, "Is this allowed? Is this allowed?" And at one point, he even raised up his hands and blurted, "Too far?" For 4 years, we lived together. At first with a roommate, a blind drag queen with the body of a farmhand whom Charles called Auntie Dave, who's up there. Eventually, we got our own apartment, removed from the downtown core and its suddenly uninteresting bars. Domestic bliss gave way to domestic doldrums, though, and then to months of relationship implosion. We'd been living apart and in confusion for 2 years when Charles got a call at work from his doctor's office. The results of some blood work had come in, and the doctor wanted to see him as soon as possible. For the 20 minutes it took to walk there, Charles told himself over and over, if I'm positive, I'll kill myself. If I'm positive, I'll kill myself. A nurse said the words to him and put a container of Ativan into his hands. She asked if he was okay, but Charles couldn't hear. He was underwater. For several hours, he wandered the streets with no destination. Eventually, he arrived at my apartment and on my couch at 4 on a Tuesday afternoon told me what had happened. I remember thinking how small he looked, and I remember that the urge to hold him was so strong I ended up in a kind of wrestler's pose with my biceps clamped at his ears and my knees painfully digging into his hips. I began murmuring these inane, helpful facts about how good the drugs are these days, and how I'd make sure he got whatever he needed. Then my proactive thinking started to feel like missing the point, and I cried with Charles until my contact lenses came out of my eyes like 2 comically large teardrops. The world became slightly illegible, and I told him, shit, I've cried my eyes out. Later, walking through the West End towards some dinner party, I cried some more for my friend, and I selfishly thought about my own health, my own blood. Best estimates tell us that a full quarter of Canadians infected with the virus aren't aware of it. The intense relief I felt when my own test came back negative was mingled with guilt. Why Charles and not me? By his own account, he'd always used condoms. I suppose it's nothing compared with the survivor's guilt that the older generation underwent during the 80s and the 90s. In British Columbia, the epidemic became so severe that on average, a person died every day of AIDS. Daily funerals, concentrated in so specific a demographic, had a crippling, if galvanizing, effect. So it's no wonder that my generation has so often inspired a war vet's exasperation in gay guys even 5 years older than us. At any rate, while I didn't fear for Charles's life the way I would have just 15 years earlier, I still feared for his happiness. Would he find someone who could love him? Someone who wouldn't be afraid? Implicit there was the addendum, afraid like I am. Charles was familiar with these fears. He'd made it clear years earlier that he was terrified of sleeping with positive guys. Now that he was positive, he was plagued with the question of finding love. Who would take him if he would not take himself? 1 year after that horrible afternoon, I attended Charles's second wedding. His groom, Graham, wore a white tuxedo and Charles a brown one. Charles hates churches, so his 100 guests, including my parents and my brother, assembled at an art gallery. Like all gay weddings, the party simultaneously subscribed to the mainstream, witness our incorporation, and disrupted it. Cupcakes instead of birthday or wedding cakes. No registry, no speeches. They're still married today, and they have the usual marital issues. I envy his marital issues. I've more or less been a bachelor since our partnership collapsed, and I'm exhausted by dating. The regular frustrations of finding love are amplified by the health concerns implicit in gay relationships. One-night stands become a kind of Russian roulette. A recent survey in Vancouver called Man Count determined that 1 in 40 gay men is HIV positive without being aware of the fact. To drive the point home, Dr. Terry Trussler, one of the report's researchers, suggested a visualization. If there are 100 guys in a gay bar, at least 2 of them won't know that they're HIV positive. This is not conducive to unbridled lust. Despite the forward march of drug discoveries, despite daily proof that many men sleep with positive guys, despite the undetectable viral loads that make transmission so unlikely, I still live in fear. Because HIV is a cipher for everything that constrains my sexuality and my potential for happiness. And no drug is going to fix that. My friends and I know what it's like to inherit a wrecked history and build on rubble, to flail around while trying to create our own culture in the wake of events that we cannot overcome. The best way I can describe our predicament to those outside our culture is to call up the sensation of orgasm. You lose control of your destiny and you're grateful for the loss. Time dissolves. Nothing that came before matters. You lose all sense of consequences, and you'd sacrifice anything to safeguard the moment. And then, just seconds later, the blighted past and an uncertain future rush back in to drown you. Thank you.